Hello, and welcome to the HRQ Quarterly Economic Insight Series. I am Carrie Sue Bench, a consulting advisory leader at HRQ, and the Quarterly Economic Insight Series was developed to help companies not only make sense of the often conflicting data in today's market, but also to gain perspective that can help organizations build resilience and take advantage of emerging opportunities. For those of you who are not familiar with HRQ, we are a professional services firm with over 20 years of serving clients across the country. Our experience working with executives provides 3 integrated services: enterprise-wide human capital consulting, interim HR talent delivery, and conducting national searches for HR professionals. Our consulting team brings a depth of experience in workforce planning and analytics, organizational design and HR transformation, and talent strategy across the enterprise. In 2019, HRQ joined forces with Landrum HR to provide end-to-end talent solutions for our clients, including PEO services and workforce management. You can find out more about all of our services by visiting our websites, hrqinc.com and landrumhr.com. A recording of this webinar will be sent to everyone who registered. Please feel free to ask questions using the question pane in the control panel. There will be a quick survey that pops up as you exit the webinar today, and we would really appreciate your feedback. And now it is my pleasure to introduce you to Brian Wilkerson. Brian is head of HRQ's consulting service line, and he is a frequently invited speaker and sought after by the press for his insight. Brian is known as an innovative strategist and has applied his cutting-edge planning techniques around the globe, where he is known for helping companies gain an edge through counterintuitive strategies. He has authored a number of articles and book chapters in his areas of expertise, and Brian has held senior leadership roles at both large enterprises and global consulting firms, and is a successful entrepreneur, having founded and sold multiple companies. Brian, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Carrie Sue, and welcome to our quarterly economic update. This is going to be an interesting one because I have lots of conflicting information to share with you. So I probably would have been much happier had I not seen some of the information that came out this morning, because we were on a really good trend, and now there's some concerns about sort of where we're heading. But to start off, we'll start by talking about the GDP overall. So the good news is that April 2020 was the official end to the recession. When you look at where we were from a Q2 real GDP perspective, hold on, we're having a little bit of slide issue here apparently. So we'll get there. I'll keep talking. So so in Q2 of 2021, we had a 6.7% increase in GDP from the first quarter. That was the second straight quarter of growth, thus ending the recession. So that's great news. Overall GDP 19.37 trillion, which is about 114 billion higher than Q4 of 2019. So kind of pre-pandemic where we were. We're now actually starting to see numbers that are ahead of where we were prior to the pandemic. We were seeing growth over pandemic numbers, but hadn't started to get back to where we were previously. Now we're starting to see that. So definitely good news. We had GDP increase in all 50 states from a low of 1.9 or 1.8 in Alaska up to about 9.7 in Nevada. Like much of our economy, consumer spending really drove a lot of GDP growth. I'll tell you why that's a bad thing in a moment, but we saw in that Q2 period, business investment and total government spending fell slightly during that time. Net exports decreased, which they very often do. We're not great at the export piece of things, but if anyone saw the early numbers this morning, it looks like we have significantly slowed down. So the Q3 preliminary numbers for GDP are only 2% as opposed to 6.7% in Q2. Making it even further concerning, if you look at consumer spending growth in Q3, it was only 1.6% as opposed to 12% in Q2. So I mentioned that the increase in consumer spending really led the GDP growth in Q2. That's reversed significantly in Q3. Furthermore, the concern is that there's another concern in that inventories increased quite a bit. So that further sort of skews those numbers, and it's looking like a significant slowdown in growth for Q3. So certainly that's a concerning sign, and we'll be continuing to look at that. Go ahead and move to the next slide, please. When you look at the GDP contribution by industry, and these are Q2 numbers, you'll see that retail, trade, and transportation and warehousing actually went down. That's concerning, as obviously, it's a consumer-driven economy here in the United States, and so that creates some concern. You'll see that the federal government numbers are very low. You might think that's bad, but that's actually good, because in a lot of ways it shows that we're getting GDP growth beyond stimulus that's created by different government programs. So we see that number as being low, as being a good thing when we're still seeing overall growth. If you look down towards more the bottom of the chart, the second to last and third to last around professional and scientific and technical services and information services, both are good news in terms of returning to a little bit more stability from an economic perspective, and hopefully we'll continue to see growth in areas such as that. The highest gainer from a GDP growth perspective was in accommodation and food services. And many of you have heard me talk before. That's always a little bit of a concern, because those are some of the ones that are probably most vulnerable to fluctuations in the economy, most cyclical, all those kinds of things. So it's good that we're seeing growth, but the concern would be, can that growth be sustained, especially if we see conditions start to change from an overall economic perspective. So some diversity in the contributions, some concerns in terms of what we're seeing here, but overall some good news in Q2. Move on to the next slide, please. So from a labor force perspective, this is one of the things that everybody's really trying to figure out what's going on here. In the end, we're still not seeing, mass return to the labor force. Unemployment rates are declining, and we are seeing people start to take some of the jobs, but we are still seeing way more openings than we have people to fill them. We're still seeing, a lot of stubbornness in terms of being able to actually fill the opportunities that are in the economy. There's lots of reasons for that. Anybody who tells you there's only one is usually trying to sell something. At the end of the day, there's factors such as childcare. When you look at childcare, simple example, there's 107,000 less people working in childcare. That translates to 600 to 800,000 less childcare spots available in the United States. That's obviously a very significant number. Schools are open, and as I travel all over the country, it's all over the place in terms of their opening strategy and who's in person, who's online, and how things are working. So that obviously creates some uncertainty in the economy. The Delta variant has been, certainly a factor that people have noted as a concern in terms of returning to work. I do have some good news on that front as we go later in the presentation. And for a long time, people pointed to the extended unemployment benefits and supplemental unemployment benefits as the reason why people have not been returning to the workforce. Well, those have ended, and we still haven't seen people return to the workforce. So it's not just that. So I think when we look at things, we're seeing some pretty seismic shifts in the labor force. One, there's a lot of people who just aren't happy with the offerings that are out there from an employer perspective. There's a lot to that. When you look at it, there's still a lot of the positions and GDP growth that you saw are in the accommodation and food services sector. There's perceptions on people's part that sector isn't as stable, and that some of the employment may not be as stable there. Also, it's seen as kind of a frontline position, that people who are concerned about COVID and the Delta variant are concerned about exposing themselves in that way. So it does create some risk, but we also are seeing risk of getting into sort of this reinforcing cycle. I'm sure almost all of you have probably seen restaurants or other establishments that have had to curtail their hours based on the fact that they couldn't get employees to be there. But if we continue to see that and that results in a decrease in consumer spending, we'll start to see, more reinforcing cycle of sort of GDP going down and then putting us back at economic risk. So there's a number of concerning signs when you start to look at things like the labor force and some of the other data that we'll get to later that says that we might not be out of the woods just yet, and that we probably need to take some stronger actions in order to be able to reverse some of these trends. Okay, move to the next slide, please. One of the things that I wanted to mention is that there's been a lot of focus over the course of the past several months on composition of the labor force and what are we seeing in terms of who's in and who's out. Continuing to see concerns in terms of how many women have left the civilian labor force. If you look at it, basically the rate of women leaving the civilian labor force in terms of their percentage of the labor force is almost twice that of men. About 1.9 million women overall and about 1.1 million men overall who still haven't returned to the labor force. And so we're still seeing issues in terms of that. Again, lots of reasons for that. I mentioned some of them earlier in terms of why people aren't returning to the labor force, but we still are seeing a disproportionate impact in terms of women coming back in. Next slide, please. We're seeing some changing trends when it comes to age. When you look at the beginning of the pandemic, we were primarily seeing workers age 55 and older leaving the workforce at a much greater rate than younger workers. Over the past 3 months, that trend has actually started to reverse, and we're seeing more people 55 plus returning to the workforce with less entrants and that younger age. And so we are seeing some of these differences. This one's a little too early to draw some definitive conclusions about what's really going on here, but it's one that we continue to watch and continue to look at as we're going through. Next slide, please. So there's a lot of significant information when you start to look at reasons for leaving. To set some context, pre-pandemic, in a given month and over time, about 1/3 or about 32% of the reasons people left jobs were due to layoffs. That was sort of the standard trend. And then people quitting was about 60% of that. When you look at what we're starting to see in terms of trends, we've had about that number of layoffs has fallen to about 22.6%, so almost 7.5% reduction in terms of layoffs being the reason why people are leaving, while resignations are increasing in terms of the reason why people are leaving their jobs. That matches with what we're hearing in a lot of places anecdotally and some other data that we're seeing, that people are making different choices when it comes to employment. They're deciding to move into different fields. They're deciding to take different positions. And there's starting to be some interesting information coming out saying basically that people who are moving are getting from one company to another are getting bigger raises than if they would stay with their existing company. So for example, some recent data that I saw said that people who are leaving and moving to a new job are ending up with a 5.4 or 5.5% increase in their salary, while people who are staying at their job are getting maybe a 3.2 or 3.3% increase. So there is a difference in terms of it's almost more advantageous for people to job hop and move someplace else. I don't think the data is as simple as that. It's not purely an economic kind of consideration. If you look at everything that we know over the past 25 years about why people leave and why people go to certain jobs, it's much more complicated than that. But that is an important factor to look at. A tight labor market does give people more opportunities to move as well, and so that's part of the piece that we're going to continue to look at. But I think from a standpoint of companies and what they should be focused on, really looking at your environment, your culture, your compensation, all those different pieces is critical right now, because we're starting to see significant increases in mobility. from a layoff perspective, I just want to mention, in a tight labor market, we do tend to see layoffs go down in terms of the reason because people are very hesitant to get rid of workers they have, even if they have to make more of a stretch to keep those workers. And so that is part of it, but very rarely do we see this big of a difference in terms of layoffs being a factor and why people leave. Usually it stays around that 1/3% and varies a little bit one way or the other. So lots of data in terms of job leaving and what people are doing there. Next slide, please. Looking at unemployment duration, we do have some real good news there. When you look at we're seeing a decline in the number of people who have been unemployed for 3 months or longer. So right now we've got about 7.8 million who are in that long-term unemployed, and that is starting to get more towards pre-pandemic levels, which generally held steady at about that 5.8 million, that number. But if you look at the trends, even if you don't sort of look specifically at the numbers, but you kind of look at the colors on the chart, we're starting to see, that percentage of people who are 27 weeks or over going down, as well as seeing unemployment duration overall, the number of people unemployed overall starting to go down as well. So definitely good news when you start to see some of those things. When you look at some of the adjustments for people entering the workforce versus people leaving the workforce, some of that has stabilized as well, and we're starting to see those percentages start to match up more to the population and what we would expect from an age demographics perspective. Next slide, please. So I've mentioned a number of times when we've done these, the Census Bureau and the Household Pulse survey that they do, and we sort of pick each quarter which stats we find that are interesting. The census is actually doing lots more questions than just this, and they're actually adding questions as the pandemic goes on and as conditions change. But some of the interesting things that we're seeing, from a stat perspective. Food scarcity is one we've talked about over the long term. Households with not enough people to eat in the past 7 days is stable at around 9%. It's good that it's stable. It's good that that number has gone down from where it has been. Obviously, we'd like to see that number be lower just overall because of the impact on people. But it is good that that number has started to stabilize a bit. Similarly, the number of households that are not current on their rent or mortgage has gone down a fair amount actually since the beginning of the year. Hopefully we see that number continue to go down. One of the more interesting things, and we certainly track a lot around the workforce environment and what people are doing around return to work, et cetera, but adults in households where someone's worked on site in the past 7 days has gone up to about 58%. So there are a lot of workplaces that are either requiring or encouraging or strongly encouraging people to start to come back to work and come back into the office. And we are starting to see in these numbers that the percentage of on-site work is continuing to increase from obviously where it's been from a pandemic level perspective. So that's kind of interesting in terms of tracking what companies are doing versus what we're seeing around return to work strategies. So very interesting survey if you get the chance to check some of it out, but these are some of the key stats that we've seen this quarter from this particular one. Next slide, please. So talk about stubborn. We're seeing consistent growth in jobs, but we're not seeing it really replace where we were previously. So when you look at some of the numbers, May of 2020, we're still below where we were from a pandemic perspective. And as these numbers come up, I'll give you a little bit of history, right? So in March and April of 2020, we essentially lost 22.3 million jobs over the course of those 2 months. So that was sort of the beginning of the pandemic and a lot of the big impacts in terms of job losses. From May of 2020 to December, we gained back about 12.3 million, so a little over half of the jobs that we had lost. And then January of this year to September of this year, we've only gained back 5 million. So that pace has slowed considerably in terms of, the number of jobs. And from a net perspective, we're still 5 million jobs less than we had, prior to the pandemic. So when you start to look at that growth, it's really has not been as strong as maybe you might look as you see some of the numbers that come out month to month. When you look at it overall, we're still fairly behind, and that growth has been slow as we start to look at it. So certainly that's concerning as we look at things. And it's even more concerning when you start to look at the unemployment numbers, and we'll talk about those in a minute as well. But that's some of the news on the sort of job growth front. To dive into a little bit more detail, if you move to the next slide, the primary gains in terms of the 1.65 million jobs that were gained in the third quarter really were primarily in the services business. Now those range from, leisure and hospitality and some of those things all the way to healthcare and professional services and education, et cetera. So it's a wide gamut, it's a big bucket. So 1.3 million of those, only 163,000 in construction and manufacturing, and 186,000 in the federal, than the government space, I should say, both federal and local. So when you look at this overall, services is still the biggest driver. This is also the place that is, I would say, somewhat more vulnerable in terms of economic fluctuations. And so we're always a little bit concerned to see that heavy drive when you look at some of those pieces. I mentioned earlier, significant growth from a GDP perspective in that sort of food service and accommodation and some of those other kinds of things. Similar in terms of, the gains here, and they made up a lot of the gains as you look across the sort of the spectrum of job growth. And so we just hope that those can stay stable and that we can continue to see, growth in some of these areas, or at least not losses. Right now, services are about 70% of the jobs overall from an economic perspective. Next slide, please. So job openings. If you look, the blue line is basically a 12-month average from a job opening perspective, and the green line is actual numbers of job openings. You can see that number continues to increase. We saw a bit of a dip as you start to look into July and August of this year from a job openings perspective as some of those jobs start to get filled. But overall, we're still seeing very high openings for organizations. That obviously puts things at risk from an economic growth perspective. If we can't get the workers, we can't necessarily provide the goods and services. That coupled with some of the supply chain things we're seeing is concerning. When you look at it, we were basically at about 11 million job openings in July. We're at about 10.4 million for August. In April of 2020, just to give you some perspective of where we were at the height of the pandemic, there were under 5 million job openings. So the number of job openings has also increased as we've started to see job growth and come back as well. So again, people still not returning to the workforce. Almost every industry is reporting sort of an opening rate of 4% or higher. When we start to see numbers in that area, what it tells us is that it's often easier for workers to actually switch industries or switch sectors when you have openings at that high of a level. And so there are opportunities for people to move between industries and move between sectors, and we're seeing quite a bit more of that anecdotally. Some of the data is starting to catch up in terms of that, but certainly we've been hearing it from an anecdotal perspective for quite some time in terms of people rethinking where they want to be, what kind of an industry they want to be in, and taking advantage of some of the openings to actually make some of those switches. Next slide, please. Not much to tell you on the self-employment front. Frankly, self-employment has stayed pretty stable. We saw a dip obviously during the pandemic, but it recovered and has basically stayed at the levels that it's been at for a long time. The Great Recession in 2008 and 2009 was when we saw an actual structural change in self-employment. That's when we started to see, essentially 9.2 or so million per month average from a self-employment perspective. For perspective, Q3 average was just over 10 million, so we're just above that sort of historically traditional mark and where we've been since the kind of 2008, 2009 area. So this is kind of trending along, not much new to talk about here. So next slide, please. So where we start to see some concerns come in some of these small business pulse survey results. We use these to try to get a little bit of an early read on where things are heading and what kinds of opportunities or concerns might be there on the horizon. So what you see here, when you look at the first chart, is how small businesses are changing in terms of the number of employees. Green is the percentage of our that have basically increased the number of paid employees, and gray is the ones who have decreased. So you saw we were trending the right way for a while, and now we're starting to see a trend back downwards in terms of reducing the number of employees that they've had. And so less people increasing and more people decreasing the number of employees that they have. So that's concerning, certainly, when we see that. Not unrelated is the second chart, which is really related to supplier delays. And you can see one is foreign, one is domestic. Both have been increasing since April of this year, and we continue to see scarcity on the supply front. We see some commodities that are consistently scarce, and we're seeing some commodities that are, periodically scarce, and supply is low. I saw some funny things recently about how this is all related to the fact that we have ships backed up in the port in Long Beach. I can tell you that that is a part of the problem, but a very small part of the problem. Even if we cleared Long Beach port tomorrow, we would not fix the supply problems that are out there. Goods come from far more places than Long Beach, all over the country, and that's sort of an easy TV example, but that is not the the root of our problem. It's much deeper than that. So these numbers start to demonstrate some concern and some things that we're going to continue to watch. If supply continues to be low, if people continue to not be able to not get workers, it really threatens our growth. And if you're looking at a 1.6% increase in GDP in the Q3, we don't have very far to fall. So I think those are some really important trends, and we'll continue to watch those. Next slide, please. Okay, so we always hit these numbers to think about because these are some of really the key metrics when you start to look at things. So 4.6% annual percent change in hourly earnings. We were actually moving up at a faster rate than that earlier in the year. But what's happening is that we're seeing return to work, more workers in lower paid industries. And so that's actually lowering the percent change in hourly earnings, right? I mentioned in a couple of these webinars previously that one of the reasons we were seeing gains was because a lot of the lower paying jobs had gone away. And so they were aggregating up to higher paying jobs. The reverse is now true as we're starting to see some of that. But what I'll go to the bottom right number next, actually. When you look at the consumer price index for the last 12 months, that's actually gone up 5.4%. So when you look at some of these, obviously that's a bit of a mismatch, right? When you look at this consumer price index, those numbers late 2019, early 2020, prior to the pandemic, were more in the 2.4, 2.5% range. So more than double what we were seeing pre-pandemic in terms of consumer prices. So it's real in terms of where these things are going. If you look at some of the things that are driving it, used cars and trucks, energy prices have gone up literally over 40% in the past 12 months. Utility and gas service prices are up 21%. So there's quite a bit in terms of increases in prices, and we're not really seeing wages keep up in terms of that. When you look at the upper right number, the annual percent change in employment cost index, it's at about 2.9%. That's what employers are actually paying in terms of increased costs for employees. So I look at that actually as a little bit, it's a different and a complementary indicator in terms of where wages are actually going, and that matches more with what we're seeing in terms of companies giving people raises in the 3 to 3.3% range. So, I look at it as 2.9% in terms of wage growth against a 5.4 consumer price index increase, and it's concerning when you look at it. Consumer confidence is at 109.3. Seems like good news, except that we were at 128.9 in June. So it's fallen a fair amount in that time frame, and it really reflects a lot of uncertainty about where the economy is going, people being more cautious about spending, and some of their overall feelings about the economy and where it is. So important macro numbers to keep an eye on, because it gives you a sense of where certain trends and prevailing things might be going. Next slide, please. When you look at, these are some of the leading indicators that we look at on a periodic basis. When you look at commercial construction spending, it's up about 6.9% from a year ago. It's good news, obviously, when you start to look at some of those things. You can see by the chart that we're not quite at pre-pandemic levels. I would question actually if we're going to get there, given some of the changes that have happened in terms of real estate and people going into offices and those kinds of things. I think it remains to be seen how high this gets, but we are starting to see some increase and steady flattening out of that increase as we start to look at recent months. When you look at new single family units that have been sold, we're actually starting to see that that's slowing down a little bit. Mortgage rates are still low, but we're starting to see, kind of a flattening of the trend. There was some decline and then a little bit of flattening, a little bit of increase around single family units that are sold. Not necessarily all bad given the heat that some of the housing markets were experiencing, but this trend is kind of stabilized in terms of that. You can see that we are, back to more of the historical trend line in terms of the level of single family units that are sold on a regular basis. Next slide, please. Durable goods orders, some good news there. We're continuing to see that climb. We're up about 18% from where we were a year ago, and obviously way above where we were at the depths of the pandemic and where a lot of the durable goods orders had gone way down. Supply is an issue on this side, and it continues to be a limiter in terms of some of the growth from a durable goods perspective. Lead times, things of that nature are up in this area, and that does cool off some of the potential spending from a durable goods perspective, but we are seeing positive trends overall in terms of that. So from a leading indicators perspective, a number of them pointing in the right direction. I think that gives us some cautious optimism about where things are going. Next slide, please. So this slide really looks at COVID case rates from the CDC, and we are starting to see downward trends from an overall COVID case perspective. Some of the numbers that we're seeing for the US overall are continuing to trend in the right direction. There are, however, a number of places around the country that kind of defy this trend overall and are still having a lot of issues. A number of places that are still seeing high rates of ICU utilization and capacity constraints from an ICU perspective. And so you are seeing still some concerns, but from an overall COVID case, in terms of new cases, we're seeing some of the right trends from the overall numbers, and hopefully that continues to happen, because that hesitancy about returning to the workforce because of potential exposure to COVID-19 is very real. It is something that we see in a lot of the data about why aren't people going back to work, why are they making different choices or choosing to go to different industries, et cetera, as they look at it. Next slide, please. So that was a bit of a roller coaster. I apologize for that. I just report the news, but as we look at it, there are a number of different trends and contradicting trends, different things going either way. And so the question is always, what should companies be thinking about? What should you be doing now? So I'll talk through sort of the top things that we would recommend at the moment and what a lot of our clients are focusing on. Very high on the list is supply chain optimization. And when I look at supply chain, I'm really talking about both supply chain of goods and supply chain of people, because both of those are going to continue to be some of the biggest constraints in terms of growth and stabilization from an economic perspective. So as a company, really looking at how you get your products and services to market and how you optimize that supply chain, whether it be people, whether it be goods, is really critical. More and more, we're helping clients really look at these two things together, how the goods supply chain and the people supply chain really affect each other and tie into each other. And this has been the place where we've started to see companies be able to make some of the most gains in terms of getting this to be more controllable, more predictable, being able to manage costs, being able to manage supply in both of those areas. So that's definitely a high priority. Second one is really around key talent retention and key knowledge loss and the potential risk for that. I mentioned the Great Resignation in the past. I mentioned some of the trends today in terms of people leaving roles and quits now becoming a higher percentage of why people are leaving roles. Every company has to really take a look and say, is our key talent at risk? You're not going to be able to keep everyone, but how can you really find those folks that are critical to driving your business and figure out how you can keep those folks, especially if they have critical knowledge that you lose when they walk out the door, or critical relationships with customers or suppliers or things of that nature that need to be managed as well. And that's an important piece of the puzzle to look at. Third, really focus on building and maintaining the culture that you want. It's been, over the course of the pandemic, it's been very difficult for organizations to maintain the culture that they want and not find what I would call almost unconscious or non-deliberate sort of slips in the culture. Some of that comes from just people not being around each other. Some of it comes from people being distracted by the pandemic and all the pressing issues that go with the pandemic. But many organizations have reported that their culture has unconsciously changed or changed, but they weren't trying to change it, or has suffered in some way through the course of the pandemic. So as people are thinking about their return to work strategies, talent retention strategies, things of that nature, culture is an important piece and an important consideration to look at. As you look at competition for workers and the scarcity of workers that are out there, more and more we're hearing that the workers aren't willing to just accept a bad culture to have a job. They have choices, they have options, they have the ability to move. And so they're not going to just go someplace because, they're hiring and there's an opportunity there. So it's a really important consideration. I'd say more so than we've seen in the past, number of years around the potential impact of culture. Labor automation is another area that's critically important. As we continue to see the trends that we're seeing from a workforce perspective, both in terms of scarcity as well as increasing costs, which we absolutely are seeing increasing costs from a workforce perspective, it's important that companies look at where there are opportunities to automate. There are places where things like machine learning and artificial intelligence may not have been as palatable or as financially feasible before as they are now, and there's opportunities there. But even more simple things in terms of taking those processes that you've always felt like you could automate and doing that to help reduce the reliance on labor, on helping reduce costs and some of those pieces. It's really kind of an optimum time for investing in some of those pieces. And finally, really looking at your workforce composition and the cost associated with it. This isn't really just a matter of worker scarcity, but it's really strategically thinking about what is the best way to get each piece of work done in your organization that needs to be done. This ties into the supply chain optimization piece that I mentioned first, and really looking at where your reliance on sort of critical talent is and making sure that you have that supply chain smoothed out. But even beyond that, thinking about outsourcing options, creative sourcing options, ways that you get work done within the organization. There's never really been a better time to think about some of those considerations and think about how do you put yourself in a place to create a stable supply, manage the costs associated with the workforce, all of those different components that companies are trying to optimize. Workforce composition and thinking about that blend of internal versus contingent versus outsource versus partner versus all those different components now is really a very strategic and opportune time for organizations to be looking at those pieces and figuring out how they might want to optimize that. Certainly, we're seeing a lot of our clients making those deep analytics and tough choices in a lot of cases to change the way that they've always done things in the past. Next slide, please. With that, I know I went through a lot, and there's a lot to sort through there. I'll open it up to questions. You can put questions in the question pane, and we will sort through those.
That's right, Brian. Thank you so much. Very insightful information. We had a question come in very early, so maybe you can help with some acronyms. It said, what do the acronyms stand for? CLF, TUR, and U6?
So CLF is civilian labor force. So that's basically all the folks that don't work in, the DoD and military kind of piece. So that's really the whole labor force. The U6, so there's two numbers that we look at from an unemployment perspective. One is what they call the U3, which is the one that you see reported all the time. So when people talk about the unemployment rate, that's usually the one that they're talking about, though there's actually multiple unemployment rates. So when you look at some of those pieces, it's a little bit confusing. But the U6 is a broader measure of unemployment because it looks at things that like, people who are work occasionally, who, sort of would prefer to be working full-time, part-time workers who want to be working full-time. So it looks at both, fully unemployed as well as underemployed. So we look at that number because it gives some important perspective that you might not otherwise get as you look at some of those things. So.
That's great. Thanks, Brian.
Mm-hmm.
We have another one. All of the data shows that wages are rising, and you mentioned it, but some leaders still aren't convinced we need to adjust. What would you say to them?
Well, I would say that I'm not saying that companies should get into bidding wars or start to look at, just randomly raising wages. But I would say a couple of things. The increases that we're seeing and the competition that we're seeing for talent is not a short-term thing. It's not going away next month. It's not going away next quarter. This is going to be here for a while. And when you look out there in the industry, there have been a number of companies who have already made pretty bold moves from a wage perspective. Just this morning, for example, Starbucks announced that everyone will make a minimum of $15 an hour in their stores over the next several months. And some of their workers who have had longer tenure will be up in the $23 per hour range, right? So when you start to look at where you are from a wage perspective, you have to start thinking about not just how are you comparing to others in your industry or those kinds of things, but you really have to look at how you compare to other opportunities that are out there, right? I have seen, for example, and this is kind of a sad commentary, right? Some production jobs that are paying less than working at a gas station or now working at Starbucks, right? And they're much harder jobs, they require more skills, those kinds of things. So when you're looking at wages, I think you have to look at three things. One, you do have to look at what your competitors are doing because there's sort of a minimum parity that you need to achieve. You don't have to be the highest paying out there, but you do need to be competitive and you do need to be in the ballpark. The second thing you need to look at is what are the other opportunities that people would go to, not necessarily just your direct competitors, but other opportunities that are out there. And then the third thing is your full value proposition. What is it that really you offer as a workplace that others don't? So someone may pay more an hour than you, but you may have better benefits. You may have a better culture. You may have a better environment. You may put more focus on your workers and take better care of your workers. So I would say to anybody who's not looking at salaries, you should be looking at salaries, and you should also be looking at the other elements that make people want to work for you or not work for you, and make sure that you've really got that where it needs to be, because the scarcity is going to continue for quite some time. I'm not saying, again, I sometimes people misquote me on this, and so I want to be clear. I'm not saying everybody has to be the highest paid in their industry or the highest paid in their geography, et cetera. That's absolutely not true. But you do have to look at your total package and make sure that you can get the workforce that you need to get, because it's going to become harder and harder. And that economic growth is absolutely going to be inhibited by your ability to get that critical supply.
Awesome, thanks, Brian. How about, what are your thoughts about the consumer having more dollars to spend on products versus services, causing challenges to the supply chain?
Well, I think, it's more a matter of allocation of dollars, right? And I think what we've seen through the course of the pandemic is that many people learn to live without certain services or reduce their consumption of certain services or those kinds of things, and focus more on the good side of things. So that is, on one hand, creating increased demand in that space and creating pressure for more goods. But, from an overall supply perspective, it's much more complicated than that, right? If you look at, for example, there's a number of I was speaking to a number of auto dealers at a meeting recently, and many of them were talking about their typical inventory on their lot is somewhere in the 175 to 200 million dollar range, and right now the most they can get is 40 million, right? So at a time when car sales overall are down because of supply, demand is there but not that. So the sort of prioritization of goods over services is creating more pressure on the supply side, but the supply problems are much bigger than just increased demand.
Great. Are you seeing any creative ways to retain key talent?
Yeah, I think there's some good things that are out there. I think that one of the biggest ones, frankly, is just much more personal interaction and personal involvement with people, and that goes a long way. So we're seeing organizations make sure that not just their managers, but their leaders are spending more time with key talent, involving them in key decisions, key projects, things of that nature, and making them feel valued. What we're also seeing, and probably the biggest trend that I think is showing promise, is really having direct conversations with key talent about what is it that you want out of your work experience. So different people want different things, whether it's more time with the family, more compensation, more incentives, whatever it is, and really trying to tailor what you're offering to meet some of those needs. So not treating everybody as interchangeable in terms of what you offer, but really thinking about what does this particular person want? And obviously that changes as people go through their life cycle and have different needs. And so that's probably one of the most promising trends that I've seen in terms of retaining those high performers. I have seen a number of organizations throw money at the problem, and this isn't any different than any other time in history, but that usually is a temporary fix that doesn't last too long. So looking at more of those work environment pieces is a big one. But yeah, talking to them and listening to them is a big one.
That's a huge one. Okay, we have a few more questions. What is your crystal ball associated with near-term CPI with the increasing cost in labor?
So a good question. When you look at that, I think that we're going to continue to see, I think we're going to see labor increases probably in the 1.5% to 2% over where they are now by sort of middle of next year. I think it's going to take quite a while for us to sort through some of these things, and I'm seeing more and more companies go after it from a wage perspective. So I think you can see those numbers, over the next 6 to 8 months. I think from a CPI perspective, though, absent some kind of, additional intervention, I think we could see 3 or even 4%. I know there's a number of economists that would tell me I'm, a heretic for saying those kinds of things, but we just don't seem to be doing anything, frankly, to try to get a handle on it. And I think there's still a lot of people who are believing that it's just going to go away on its own. And I have to be honest, I just don't see the systemic indicators that say that this is a temporary problem. So I think that we can avoid that if we intervene in a number of ways. But if we start seeing raises in interest rates and some different things like that, I think we'll start to see, unfortunately, a number of those pieces go. Now, the countervailing factor, and this is going to sound it's going to sound weird, but the fact that supply is so tough, we'll see what impact that has on things, and so that could take things a little bit either way. But unfortunately, I see potentially 3% or even more increase in CPI if we're not careful over the next several months.
Okay, well, we're going to take one last question. If we didn't get to you, we will send out a response to you after the webinar. Brian, you've emphasized culture in a couple of these webinars now. Why do you see that as so important?
Yeah, so I do talk about that a lot. When you look at culture, I think it's the thing that more and more people are going to be asking about as they're evaluating where they want to go and where they want to stay. And they're not, I mentioned it earlier, they're not so willing to just accept a bad culture to have a job. And I think people not only feel like they have choices, but we really have seen an almost systemic reevaluation of what's important to people from a work perspective. And, they're just not willing to deal with the bad cultures as much. So I think that it's not something that if you have a problem is easy to fix. It takes time, it takes a lot of concentrated effort to do. And so you need to either make sure that you're getting ahead of it and not having problems in that respect, or if you do, jumping on it as soon as you can, because it's going to be one of the more important factors in terms of retaining the workers that you want to retain over time and attracting the workers that you want to attract over time. And in this economy and with the job market the way it is, I'm not sure that there's another choice. So there are organizations who have in the past sort of said, hey, I'm going to pay more because I know my culture isn't great. I'm not sure that that's going to get you there going forward, especially in some of the short-term trends that we see, both in terms of worker preference and overall scarcity.
Well, culture is very important. So we'll go ahead and wrap this up. Brian, thank you for the time and effort you and the consulting team put together in providing this content. And on behalf of HRQ and Landrum HR, thank you for joining us and have a terrific day.